Picture this. It's 1920 and a Chinese mother is selling her 7-year-old daughter to an opium den owner. Not for money, for one more pipe. Her hands are shaking so violently she can barely hold the transaction papers. This woman, like 40 million other Chinese citizens at the time, is chemically enslaved. And the family responsible for her addiction? They're being knighted by the British royal family at that exact moment, 4,000 miles away in London. Today, we're exposing the Sassoon family, the narco dynasty that made the Sacklers look like amateurs. These weren't street dealers. They controlled 70% of the world's opium supply, generated 14% of Britain's entire Indian revenue, and did it all while building hospitals with their blood money. And here's what makes this story absolutely insane. Millions of people still praise them as philanthropists. So buckle in, because by the end of this video, you'll understand how one family weaponized addiction, bought their way into European nobility, and then vanished into the shadows, possibly still controlling fortunes we can't even trace. The year is 1832. David Sassoon is running for his life through the streets of Baghdad. The city's governor has turned on his family, and David knows what happens to wealthy Jews when power shifts in the Ottoman Empire. He's seen the confiscations, the imprisonments, the disappearances. So he makes a desperate choice: abandon everything and flee to British India with his wife and children. But here's what the history books won't tell you. David didn't arrive in Bombay as a refugee. He arrived as an asset. You see, the British East India Company had a problem. They needed middlemen for their most profitable and most evil trade operation in history. But they couldn't use Indian merchants because, well, if those merchants got too powerful, they might rebel. They couldn't use British merchants because the operation was so morally reprehensible that even some company officials wanted plausible deniability. They needed someone desperate, someone brilliant, someone with international connections and absolutely zero political power in India. They needed the Sassoons. And David Sassoon understood the assignment perfectly. Let me take you inside. David Jess' first meeting with British officials in 1832. The conversation probably went something like this. Mr. Sassoon, we understand you have merchant connections throughout Persia and the Ottoman territories. I do. And you understand the opium business? I understand many businesses. This one is delicate. The Chinese don't want it. Their emperor has banned it. But we need their silver, and they need our product, whether they know it or not. David would have understood immediately. This wasn't just business. This was a license to print money, backed by the full military power of the British Empire. All he had to do was surrender his conscience. He signed on that day. Now here's where this gets truly horrifying. The opium the Sassoons trafficked wasn't like marijuana or even cocaine. This was pharmaceutical-grade heroin his grandfather processed, from poppies grown on thousands of acres of Indian farmland that should have been growing food. The British had perfected the system: force Indian farmers to grow opium instead of crops, process it in government factories, package it in 120-pound chests, each containing enough opium to addict entire villages, then auction it to families like the Sassoons, who would smuggle it into China through a network of fast ships and bribed officials. In 1836 alone, just 4 years after David arrived in India, the Sassoon Company shipped 30,000 chests to China. Do the math, that's 3.6 million pounds of opium. Enough to addict every man, woman, and child in modern-day Chicago, twice. And here's the thing that makes my blood boil. The Sassoons weren't just passive middlemen. They innovated. They optimized. They turned drug trafficking into a science. David Sassoon established a network of Sassoon family members and trusted agents in every major Chinese port. They didn't just sell opium, they created desire for it. They bribed Chinese officials. They hired local distributors. They offered credit to addicts who'd run out of silver. They were running the exact same playbook that Purdue Pharma would use with OxyContin 170 years later. Let me paint you a picture that the philanthropy-obsessed historians always skip. It's 1850. You're walking through Canton's opium dens, and there are thousands of them now, where there were none 20 years ago. The smell hits you first, sweet, acrid, like burning flowers mixed with human sweat and despair. The rooms are dark, lit by oil lamps, packed with wooden benches where men lie in various stages of consciousness. In the corner, a merchant who once owned 3 silk shops is pawning his last set of clothes for one more pipe. His family disowned him months ago. On the next bench, a teenage boy, somebody's son, is experiencing his first high. He doesn't know it yet, but he's already addicted. The chemical hooks are in his brain, rewiring his dopamine system. He'll be dead within 5 years. This isn't speculation. Chinese government records from the 1850s describe exactly these scenes. They estimated that by mid-century, 1 in 3 adult Chinese men in coastal provinces was addicted to opium. That's not using occasionally. That's full-blown, life-destroying, family-abandoning addiction. And every single one of those addictions generated silver that flowed into Sassoon bank accounts. But here's where the Sassoons showed their true genius. They understood that wealth without reputation is just money. They needed legitimacy. They needed people to look at them and see benefactors, not drug lords. So they bought it. David Sassoon started donating massive sums to build schools in Bombay. Not just any schools, beautiful, architect-designed institutions with libraries and laboratories. He funded hospitals, synagogues, and public fountains. He employed thousands in textile mills, which, yes, were also funded by opium money, but at least those created legitimate jobs. And it worked. Brilliantly. By the 1850s, ordinary Indians saw the Sassoon name on schools and hospitals and thought, what generous people. They had no idea that every brick in those buildings was mortared with Chinese suffering. The British loved this arrangement. The Sassoons were the perfect proof of concept. See? Our empire lifts people up. Look at these Baghdad refugees who became pillars of society. It was the Victorian equivalent of billionaire philanthropy today, using charity to launder your reputation while the exploitation continues. Then came 1839, and the Chinese emperor finally had enough. He appointed a commissioner named Lin Zexu, who actually had a spine. Lin confiscated 20,000 chests of opium from British and Sassoon warehouses and destroyed it publicly. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking her, essentially, would you allow this poison in your country? Then why force it on us? The British response? War. That's right. Britain went to war twice to force China to accept opium imports. They called it free trade. It was narco-imperialism, pure and simple. And the Sassoons? They were celebrating. Because they understood what the Opium Wars really meant. The Chinese market was about to be blown wide open. After Britain's victory in 1842, the Treaty of Nanking forced China to open 5 ports to British trade and pay massive indemnities. For the Sassoons, this was Christmas. Their shipments exploded from 30,000 chests to 59,000 chests by the 1850s. Let that sink in. A military invasion, thousands dead, a nation humiliated, and the primary beneficiaries were drug traffickers. David's son, Albert Sassoon, took over the business during this golden age of narcotics. And Albert wasn't just content with being rich, he wanted to be royalty. Here's where this story gets almost comical in its audacity. Albert Sassoon literally bought his way into the British aristocracy using drug money, and everyone knew it and nobody cared. In 1853, David Sassoon became a British citizen, extremely rare for a colonial subject. By the 1860s, the family was purchasing estates across England, mansions in London, country homes with sprawling grounds, properties that put them in the same social circles as dukes and earls. Albert's son, Reuben Sassoon, became best friends with the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. Let me repeat that. The heir to the British throne was hanging out with the son of an opium dealer. They attended the same parties, they vacationed together. Edward VII even visited the Sassoon mansion in Bombay in 1875. And then because this story needed to get more insane, the Sassoons married into the Rothschild family. Albert's son married a Rothschild daughter, uniting 2 of the most powerful Jewish dynasties in the world. Think about that alliance for a second. The Rothschilds financed European wars and governments. The Sassoons supplied the opium that balanced Britain's trade deficits. Together, they were integral to the machinery of the British Empire. One family controlled money. The other controlled drugs. It was the perfect partnership. Albert Sassoon even commissioned a family crest featuring a poppy flower, the source of opium. He wasn't hiding what made him rich. He was proud of it. But here's the tragic ironic twist. Despite all their wealth and titles, the Sassoons could never fully escape their origins. They tried desperately to become British-speaking English at home, dressing in European fashion, abandoning much of their Jewish and Baghdadi traditions. Some family members became so assimilated, they were embarrassed when relatives from India visited them in London. There are accounts of Sassoon descendants literally hiding their Indian connections, pretending their fortunes came from trade without specifying what kind. They had everything money could buy, but they were trapped between two worlds, too brown for Victorian England, too wealthy and westernized for their own community. They'd sold their souls for acceptance into a system that would never truly accept them. One descendant later called the family fortune money made in the East by dirty trading. Even they knew what they'd done. By the 1890s, the Sassoon Empire should have been unstoppable. They had wealth, connections, and a global network that spanned 3 continents. But here's what always destroys dynasties: internal betrayal. The family split into 2 rival factions: David Sassoon and Company, the original firm, and E.D. Sassoon and Company, a breakaway venture. And these weren't just separate businesses, they became bitter enemies, competing for the same opium contracts, undercutting each other's prices, sabotaging deals. Imagine 2 branches of the same family with the same last name, trying to destroy each other financially. And the insane part? They were both still trafficking opium. They were competing to see who could addict more Chinese people faster. This internal war eroded their dominance. Other British and Indian firms saw the opening and moved in. The Sassoon monopoly began to crack. But here's the tragic ironic twist. Despite all their wealth and titles, the Sassoons could never fully escape their origins. They tried desperately to become British-speaking English at home, dressing in European fashion, abandoning much of their Jewish and Baghdadi traditions. Some family members became so assimilated, they were embarrassed when relatives from India visited them in London. There are accounts of Sassoon descendants literally hiding their Indian connections, pretending their fortunes came from trade without specifying what kind. They had everything money could buy, but they were trapped between 2 worlds, too brown for Victorian England, too wealthy and westernized for their own community. They'd sold their souls for acceptance into a system that would never truly accept them. One descendant later called the family fortune money made in the East by dirty trading. Even they knew what they'd done. By the 1890s, the Sassoon Empire should have been unstoppable. They had wealth, connections, and a global network that spanned 3 continents. But here's what always destroys dynasties: internal betrayal. The family split into 2 rival factions: David Sassoon and Company, the original firm, and E.D. Sassoon and Company, a breakaway venture. And these weren't just separate businesses, they became bitter enemies, competing for the same opium contracts, undercutting each other's prices, sabotaging deals. Imagine 2 branches of the same family with the same last name, trying to destroy each other financially. And the insane part? They were both still trafficking opium. They were competing to see who could addict more Chinese people faster. This internal war eroded their dominance. Other British and Indian firms saw the opening and moved in. The Sassoon monopoly began to crack. In 1949, everything changed. Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War, and the new government had very clear ideas about foreign capitalists who'd grown rich off Chinese suffering. They nationalized everything. Victor's billion-dollar real estate empire seized the Sassoon hotels, office buildings, warehouses, now property of the People's Republic. The family that had spent a century extracting wealth from China had everything taken in a single year. Victor fled Shanghai with whatever portable wealth he could carry. The E.D. Sassoon Company never recovered. By the 1970s, it existed only as a minor trading firm with a famous name but no real power. The Sassoon Empire was over. Here's what infuriates me about the Sassoon story. Walk through Mumbai today and you'll see their name everywhere. Sassoon Docks, the David Sassoon Library, Sassoon Hospital. Beautiful Victorian buildings that tourists photograph and locals use daily. And almost nobody knows what paid for them. The plaques say philanthropist. They say benefactor of Mumbai. Some even call David Sassoon the father of Bombay, but they don't mention the millions of Chinese lives destroyed. They don't talk about the families torn apart by addiction. They don't acknowledge that every rupee donated came from one of history's largest drug trafficking operations. This is how power works. If you steal enough and donate some of it back, people will build statues of you. If your crimes are big enough and far enough away, you become a historical figure instead of a criminal. The Sassoons understood this better than almost anyone in history. Let me bring this into 2025. Does this story sound familiar? A wealthy family, a highly addictive substance. Aggressive marketing to vulnerable populations. Billions in profits. Some philanthropy and art museum donations. And when the crisis becomes undeniable, they claim they didn't know how addictive it was, or that they were just meeting market demand. I'm talking about the Sackler family and the opioid epidemic, of course. Purdue Pharma's OxyContin strategy was the Sassoon playbook updated for the 21st century. Create addiction, maximize profit, use philanthropy to whitewash your reputation. And when it all falls apart, hide behind lawyers and bankruptcy protection. The Sassoons trafficked opium for 120 years and got knighthoods. The Sacklers trafficked opioids for 20 years and got their names removed from museum wings. The main difference? Modern media and accountability. But here's my question. In 100 years, will there be a Sackler library that people use without knowing the story? Will their crimes be forgotten while their charitable contributions are remembered? History suggests, probably yes. Now here's where this story gets genuinely mysterious. The official narrative says the Sassoon business empire collapsed in the mid-20th century. The Shanghai assets were seized, the Indian mills were sold, the family scattered across London, Paris, and New York, and that's that. But some financial historians aren't convinced. Here's what we know. The Sassoons were extraordinarily sophisticated with money. They didn't just make wealth, they moved it, hid it, invested it through layers of trusts and holding companies. By the early 1900s, they had operations in banking, insurance, real estate, and maritime shipping across 4 continents. When you have that much wealth, that globally distributed, and that legally protected, it doesn't just vanish because one branch of the business fails. Some researchers have traced Sassoon capital through investment vehicles that still exist today, transformed, renamed, but possibly still controlled by descendants or trust structures. There are property holdings in London whose ownership chains lead back to Sassoon-era trusts. There are investment funds with suspiciously familiar names in their corporate histories. I can't prove this. Nobody can, which is exactly the point. Generational wealth at that level doesn't disappear, it goes underground. It becomes invisible. The families learn that flashy displays of wealth bring scrutiny, so they become quiet rich instead of loud rich. The Sassoons of the 19th century built hospitals with their names on them. The Sassoons of the 21st century, if they exist as a financial entity, probably operate through anonymous LLCs and offshore trusts that would take a forensic accountant years to unravel. This story forces us to confront some really uncomfortable questions. Question 1. If someone makes $1 billion destroying lives, then donates 10% to charity, are they a philanthropist or a criminal who's good at PR? Question 2. Why do we name buildings after robber barons and drug dealers just because enough time has passed? Question 3. How many respectable fortunes today are built on hidden exploitation that we just haven't uncovered yet? Question 4. Is there any moral difference between what the Sassoons did in the 1800s and what pharmaceutical companies, social media platforms, or exploitative hedge funds do today? I don't have clean answers to these questions. But I know this, the Sassoon story is a mirror. What we see in it reveals what we're willing to excuse in our own time. Here's what the Sassoon family proved. In the right circumstances, with the right political backing, you can commit atrocities on a massive scale and not only get away with it, you can be celebrated for it. They showed that philanthropy is the perfect moral laundering system. Build enough hospitals and libraries, and people will forget you're a drug lord. They demonstrated that proximity to power, whether through royal connections, strategic marriages, or political donations, grants you immunity that ordinary people will never have. And perhaps most cynically, they proved that if your crimes are far enough away from the people praising you, those crimes become abstractions. The people using Sassoon Library in Mumbai do and think about Chinese opium addicts because those addicts are distant in time, space, and cultural connection. The Sassoon family went from refugees to nobility in a single generation by understanding one fundamental truth. The system doesn't punish you for being evil. It punishes you for being poor and evil. If you're rich enough, evil becomes controversial business practices. Mass addiction becomes trade, policy. Human destruction becomes economic development. And 150 years later, your victims are forgotten while your name is on buildings. This is the real lesson of the Sassoon Empire. We don't live in a world where good people succeed and bad people fail. We live in a world where successful people get to write their own moral narratives, and the rest of us eventually believe them. The opium dens of 19th century China are gone. The addicts are dead. Their family's trauma has faded from historical memory. But the Sassoon name remains, carved in stone on institutions that still serve people today. And somewhere possibly in a trust document filed in a London law office or an investment vehicle registered in the Cayman Islands. The fortune they built on human suffering might still be growing, still compounding, still generating returns, just more quietly now, because that's what generational wealth does. It doesn't die, it doesn't apologize. It just gets better at staying hidden. If you've made it this far, drop a poppy emoji in the comments, but maybe think about what that flower really represents. And if this story made you angry, good. That anger is the only thing that might prevent the next Sassoon family from building their empire on our suffering. Subscribe to the channel for more such interesting videos. Because history doesn't repeat, but it sure as hell rhymes.